War is as old as humanity itself. Since the first civilizations rose from the dust of ancient rivers, men have fought each other for land, resources, power, and survival. But even in the chaos of war, even in the darkest moments of human conflict, societies across the world, separated by oceans, languages, and centuries, arrived at a remarkable conclusion. There must be rules. There must be limits. Even in the business of killing, some things must remain forbidden. These weren't written by one government or enforced by one empire. They emerged organically from human conscience, from religion, from philosophy, from the simple recognition that without boundaries, war doesn't just destroy armies, it destroys civilization itself. Scholars call these the universal laws of war. Protect civilians, spare the wounded, treat prisoners with dignity. Do not use weapons designed purely to cause suffering. Do not destroy what does not need to be destroyed. For thousands of years, these principles existed in various forms. In the codes of ancient India's Mahabharata, in Islamic rules of jihad, in medieval European chivalry, in Chinese military philosophy. They were imperfect, often ignored, but they existed. Humanity agreed on something. And then, in the modern era, the era of science, democracy, and human rights, we broke almost every single one of them. Not once, not in desperation, but repeatedly, systematically, and sometimes with careful planning. This is the story of when humanity looked at its own rules and decided they didn't apply anymore. Let's start with the rule that seems most obvious, most sacred, most impossible to argue against. Civilians must not be deliberately targeted in war. This principle is ancient. It is universal. Every major religious and military tradition in human history has recognized that the person farming their field, the woman raising her children, the old man who cannot lift a sword, these people are not combatants. They are not your enemy. They must be protected. And yet, the 20th century, the most technologically advanced century in human history, made the deliberate killing of civilians not just a side effect of war, but its central strategy. When the First World War ended, military planners began studying what had gone wrong. Trenches had proven almost impossible to break through. Frontal assaults had slaughtered millions of soldiers with almost no territorial gain. A new idea began to take shape. What if you bypass the army entirely? What if, instead of destroying the enemy's military, you destroyed the enemy's will to fight? You bomb their cities, you kill their workers, you shatter their infrastructure. You make the population so desperate for peace that their government surrenders. This strategy had a name. It was called strategic bombing, and it would kill more civilians in the Second World War than any weapon before it. The German bombing of Warsaw, Rotterdam, London, and Coventry killed tens of thousands of civilians. Britain and America responded with a campaign that dwarfed anything the Germans had done. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 created a firestorm that burned at temperatures so extreme that people were incinerated where they stood. Estimates of civilian dead range from 25,000 to over 100,000 in a city that had no significant military value by that point in the war. The bombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed more people in a single night than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Over 80,000 civilians died in hours as American bombers dropped incendiary devices on a city built largely of wood. And then came the atomic bombs themselves. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, 2 cities, 2 moments, roughly 200,000 people dead, the overwhelming majority of them civilians, children walking to school, mothers preparing breakfast, workers heading to factories, gone. Not as collateral damage, not by accident. These cities were chosen specifically because they were intact, undamaged urban centers whose destruction would demonstrate maximum psychological impact to the Japanese government. The targeting was, by definition, of civilian populations. The architects of these attacks knew it, and they did it anyway, justified by the argument that it would end the war faster and save more lives in the long run. Whether that justification holds up historically is still debated, but the act itself, the deliberate targeting of civilian population centers as a strategy of war, was a profound violation of the most fundamental rule humanity had ever agreed upon. The rule against torture and the humane treatment of prisoners is equally ancient. Sun Tzu wrote about it. Islamic law codified it in the 7th century. The medieval laws of chivalry upheld it. The Geneva Conventions, signed in 1864 and expanded throughout the 20th century, made it binding international law. Prisoners of war must be treated humanely. They cannot be tortured. They cannot be executed. They retain their dignity even in captivity.
Japan's treatment of Allied prisoners during the Second World War stands as one of the most documented violations of this principle. The Bataan Death March of 1942 forced 70,000 Filipino and American prisoners to walk 65 miles through tropical heat with almost no food or water. Those who fell were bayoneted or shot. Those who stopped to help their comrades were executed alongside them. Of the 70,000 who began the march, thousands died before reaching the prison camps. Those who survived the march entered a camp system where disease, starvation, and arbitrary brutality killed them by the thousands more. In Europe, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany treated each other's prisoners with almost incomprehensible brutality, partly because both nations had refused to sign the relevant Geneva Convention provisions, and partly because each viewed the other's soldiers as subhuman enemies who deserved no protection. Of the approximately 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany, an estimated 3.3 million died in captivity. Of German soldiers captured by the Soviets, roughly 1/3 never returned home. But violations of prisoner rights were not limited to the fascist and communist powers of the mid-20th century. The United States, a nation that had championed the Geneva Conventions and prosecuted Japanese officers for waterboarding American prisoners, developed and deployed a systematic torture program in the years following the September 11th attacks. The CIA's Enhanced Interrogation Program, authorized at the highest levels of the American government, subjected prisoners at Guantanamo Bay and CIA black sites around the world to waterboarding, sleep deprivation lasting weeks, stress positions, sensory deprivation, and other techniques that the U.S. had previously prosecuted as war crimes when used against its own soldiers. A Senate Intelligence Committee report, released in 2014, concluded not only that these techniques were torture, but that they had produced no unique or valuable intelligence that could not have been obtained through legal means. The program had violated the law, violated American values, and had not even achieved its stated purpose. It had happened anyway. Chemical weapons represent one of the most universally condemned categories of armaments in human history. Even in ancient times, the use of poison was considered dishonorable, a coward's weapon, something beyond the pale of legitimate warfare. The modern world codified this revulsion in the Chemical Weapons Convention, one of the most widely ratified treaties on Earth, which prohibits the development, production, stockpiling, and use of chemical weapons. The First World War introduced industrial-scale chemical warfare to the world. Chlorine gas at Ypres in 1915, mustard gas later that same year. Men who survived the initial exposure would spend days dying, their lungs dissolving, their skin blistering from the inside out, their eyes swelling shut. The suffering was so distinctive, so deliberately designed to maximize agony, that it galvanized global opinion. After the war, the international community banned chemical weapons. The world had seen what they did and collectively decided, never again. Never again lasted about 20 years. Italy used mustard gas against Ethiopian forces in 1935 and 1936, killing thousands of soldiers and civilians who had no protection against it. Japan used chemical and biological weapons against Chinese civilians and soldiers throughout the Second World War. Nazi Germany developed the nerve agents taboon and sarin, substances so lethal that a few milligrams on the skin could kill a healthy adult within minutes and produce them by the ton, though they were ultimately not deployed on the battlefield due to fears of Allied retaliation. Chemical weapons didn't disappear after 1945. Iraq used them against Iranian forces during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, with Saddam Hussein's government deploying mustard gas and nerve agents in some of the largest chemical attacks since the First World War. And then, in 1988, Iraq used chemical weapons against its own Kurdish population in the Anfal campaign.
The attack on the town of Halabja on March 16, 1988, killed between 3,200 and 5,000 Kurdish civilians, men, women, and children, with a mixture of mustard gas and nerve agents. Survivors described seeing parents clutching their children as they fell, people running and collapsing mid-stride, a town full of the dead frozen in the positions they had occupied at the moment the gas reached them. It was the largest chemical attack against a civilian population in history. And in Syria, beginning around 2013, the Assad government used chemical weapons, including sarin and chlorine, against civilian populations in opposition-controlled areas. The Ghouta attack of August 2013 killed hundreds of people while they slept. Children were photographed in rows, their small bodies showing no signs of physical trauma, killed by gas in their beds. The international community expressed outrage. Some governments called for military strikes. Ultimately, the response was largely diplomatic, and the use of chemical weapons in Syria continued for years. The principle of proportionality, that the harm caused by a military action must be proportional to the military advantage gained, is central to the laws of war. You cannot bomb an entire city to kill one sniper. You cannot destroy a nation's water supply to disable an army base. The damage you cause must be commensurate with the military objective you are trying to achieve. The concept of collective punishment, punishing an entire population for the actions of some of its members, is explicitly prohibited under international humanitarian law. It is one of the oldest rules in the book, and yet it has been deployed again and again by powerful nations and armed groups alike against civilian populations around the world. The Nazi policy of hostage-taking and mass reprisals was perhaps the most systematically implemented version of collective punishment in modern history. When partisans killed German soldiers in occupied territories, the response was to round up and execute civilians, sometimes 10, sometimes 50 for every German killed, depending on the rank of the victim. Villages were burned, communities were massacred. The logic was simple. Make the cost of resistance so catastrophic for ordinary people that they would turn against the partisans in their midst. The policy violated every rule of war and, as historians have documented, was also strategically counterproductive. It drove more people toward resistance movements than it suppressed. But collective punishment was not a uniquely German or fascist phenomenon. Allied forces engaged in mass displacement and destruction of civilian property in response to guerrilla activity in numerous theaters of war. During the American War in Vietnam, the policy of destroying villages suspected of harboring Viet Cong sympathizers, burning homes, killing livestock, forcibly relocating populations, constituted collective punishment of civilians for the actions of combatants among them. The massacre at My Lai in 1968, where American soldiers killed between 350 and 500 unarmed South Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and elderly people, was not an isolated incident of individual madness. It was the product of policies that had systematically dehumanized the Vietnamese population and defined entire villages as enemy territory. Perhaps no violation of the universal laws of war is more difficult to discuss than genocide. The deliberate attempt to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. The Genocide Convention of 1948 was drafted explicitly in response to the Holocaust, with the stated intention that such a crime would never be allowed to happen again. World leaders signed it. Nations ratified it. The word genocide entered the international vocabulary as the ultimate crime, the crime of crimes, the act that civilization had decided it would not tolerate. And then it happened again, and again, and again.
In Cambodia between 1975 and 1979, the Khmer Rouge killed between 1.5 and 2 million people, roughly 25% of the country's entire population, through execution, forced labor, starvation, and disease. Intellectuals, ethnic minorities, religious figures, and anyone considered an enemy of the radical agrarian utopia the regime was trying to create were systematically murdered. Mass graves were dug, skull pits were filled. The international community knew what was happening and, largely paralyzed by Cold War politics, did very little. In Rwanda in 1994, Approximately 800,000 Tutsi civilians and moderate Hutus were killed in 100 days, a rate of killing that exceeded even the Holocaust in its intensity. Neighbors killed neighbors. Husbands killed Tutsi wives rather than face punishment for having them. Churches filled with refugees were surrounded and attacked with machetes and grenades. Radio broadcasts directed the killing, naming names, giving locations, exhorting the perpetrators. The United Nations had peacekeeping forces in Rwanda. The UN commander on the ground, Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, repeatedly requested authorization to intervene. He was told to stand down. The Security Council, led by the United States, actively worked to prevent the use of the word genocide in official communications because the word would trigger legal obligations to act. By the time the world began to respond, 800,000 people were dead.
In Bosnia, between 1992 and 1995, Bosnian Serb forces carried out systematic ethnic cleansing against the Muslim Bosniak population. Mass executions, rape camps, the destruction of mosques and cultural heritage sites designed to erase the evidence that Bosniaks had ever existed in the region. The massacre at Srebrenica in July 1995 killed approximately 8,000 Bosniak men and boys, the largest mass killing in Europe since the Second World War, carried out within sight of Dutch UN peacekeepers who had been tasked with protecting the civilian population. There is a pattern to all of these violations. They do not happen because the people committing them have no knowledge of the rules. They happen because the people in power decide in the moment that the rules do not apply to them, that their enemy is too dangerous, too subhuman, too threatening to be afforded the protections that civilization has agreed upon, that the stakes are too high to be constrained by law, that the ends justify the means. This is always the logic. Every nation, every movement, every leader who has broken the universal laws of war has offered some version of this justification. The atomic bomb will end the war faster. The torture will prevent the next attack. The village must be burned because the enemy hides among civilians. The group must be eliminated because they are a threat to our existence.
And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, these justifications even contain a grain of operational truth. War is genuinely complex. Enemies do hide among civilians. Terrorism does create situations where intelligence is desperately needed. The calculus of suffering is not always simple or obvious. But the laws of war were not written for easy situations. They were written precisely for moments of desperation, fear, and perceived necessity. They were written because human beings, when frightened and powerful, and told that the survival of everything they love depends on their next decision, will convince themselves that anything is justified. The laws exist to say, even then, especially then, there are things you cannot do. Because if you cross those lines, you don't just commit a crime. You unravel something fundamental about what it means to be a civilization rather than just a collection of armed groups pursuing their interests through violence. The legacy of these violations echoes forward through time in ways that are still reshaping our world. The 20th century war crimes created the international legal architecture we live under today. The International Criminal Court, the doctrine of crimes against humanity, the responsibility to protect. They created generations of trauma that fuel conflicts decades later. They established precedents that authoritarian governments have cited to justify their own atrocities. When Saddam Hussein was asked about his use of chemical weapons against the Kurds, he pointed to historical examples of Western powers using similar weapons. When authoritarian governments crack down on civilian populations, they invoke the Allied bombing campaigns of the Second World War. When powerful nations want to ignore rules that inconvenience them, they cite the exceptions carved out by other powerful nations before them. Every violation of the laws of war becomes, in some sense, permission for the next one. This is the deepest cost of breaking these rules. Not just the immediate dead, not just the suffering of the victims, but the erosion of the framework itself. Each time a powerful nation decides that the laws do not apply to it, the laws become weaker. Each time the international community watches a violation happen and does nothing, impunity grows. Each time perpetrators are not held accountable, they invite their successors to follow the same path. None of this means the laws of war are useless. The fact that they are violated does not mean we should abandon them. A city with laws against murder is still better than a city without them, even if murders still happen.
The laws of war have saved lives, countless lives, even in their imperfect, frequently ignored, often selectively applied form. They have created accountability, however incomplete. They have given victims a language and a legal framework to demand justice. They have shaped military training, constraints and operations that would otherwise have been catastrophic, and established the principle, however aspirational, that warfare has limits. But the history of how humanity has broken its own universal rules of war should humble us. It should destroy the comfortable fiction that atrocity is something that only backward, primitive, or uniquely evil people commit. The nations that bombed Dresden and Hiroshima were democracies. The officials who authorized torture programs were educated lawyers and politicians who had sworn oaths to constitutions that prohibited cruel and unusual punishment. The soldiers who carried out massacres were ordinary people who had been trained, conditioned, and ordered by institutions to treat other human beings as less than human. The capacity for this is not a bug in human nature that we can eliminate.